After years of so-called enlargement fatigue, it suddenly looks like the EU is moving towards another round of expansion. Brussels is working on a two-speed plan that could give Ukraine partial membership as early as next year. Accession frontrunner Montenegro closed another negotiating chapter last month, and now it's been reported that Iceland is weighing a vote on restarting EU membership talks as early as August, after the country suspended negotiations over a decade ago. So in this video, we're going to look into Iceland's relationship with the EU, why joining the EU is back on the table, and how soon it could possibly happen. If you've read George Orwell's 1984, you might remember the book's three powerful superstates, covering today's US, Russia and China. In the latest issue of our magazine, we consider how these Orwellian spheres of influence are taking shape, and whether we're entering a new age of empires. That's just one of 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. For years, Iceland has been deeply integrated with the EU. In the 70s, the country became part of the European Free Trade Association, the European Economic Area, and signed a bilateral free trade agreement with the bloc. Since then, Iceland further integrated with the EU by signing up to the Schengen area and the Dublin Agreement on asylum policy. During the aftermath of the financial crisis, there was considerable talk as to whether Iceland should push forward and join the EU fully. For some, membership of the EU, and specifically adoption of the euro, was seen as a safe haven following the near collapse of the Icelandic krona in 2008. So much so that in 2009, Iceland formally began the process to join the EU, under the Social Democrat Alliance-led government. This was at a time when the krona had lost half its value, and when Iceland became the first Western European nation in over 25 years to appeal to the IMF for financial assistance. However, a key stumbling block to joining was the EU's common fisheries policy, which would allow fishermen across the EU access to Iceland's waters. For a country where fishing occupies such a central place in society and the economy, employing over 5% of the workforce and accounting for an estimated 25% of GDP, when indirect effects are included, giving up control of their fisheries was a very controversial issue. In 2013, the topic of joining lost traction after the Social Democrat Alliance lost the general elections to two centre-right Eurosceptic opposition parties that later formed a coalition. The new government put negotiations on hold and in 2015 dropped Iceland's EU bid entirely. Since then, EU membership hasn't really been discussed, and nearly every poll has shown that more citizens are against joining the EU than for it. However, in recent years, the debate of joining the EU resurfaced. There's been a few reasons for this, most notably Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and growing economic uncertainty on the island. For context, while Iceland ranks among Europe's wealthiest nations on a per capita basis, successive governments have struggled to bring down inflation and borrowing costs, which are some of the highest in the OECD. This has led to a difficult cost of living crisis, all exacerbated by Iceland's vulnerable fishing and tourism-dependent economy, which has suffered a slowdown in recent years. As a result, some argue that Iceland could benefit from the expanded market access and trade-related advantages offered by EU membership. In 2022, members of the Social Democrat Alliance requested the centre-right government hold an EU referendum and created a draft bill a year later. Then, in late 2024, escalating public discontent over the cost of living crisis and disagreements over migration and foreign policy within the government led to its collapse and fresh elections in November. These elections were essentially won by the Social Democrat Alliance, and, after forming a coalition with the People's Party and Liberal Reformists, the new government agreed to hold a referendum on resuming negotiations on EU membership by 2027. However, in the last year or so, Iceland's growing unease about its place in an increasingly geopolitically unstable world has fostered a new sense of urgency. Soon after the Social Democrats won the election, Donald Trump returned to the White House and began threatening to annex Greenland. Both Iceland and Greenland occupy strategic locations in the North Atlantic, just south of the Arctic Circle, which has apparently become a massive point of strategic interest for the US. These anxieties were exacerbated by the fact that, in January, Trump mentioned Iceland on multiple occasions during the Davos summit as a point of strategic interest to the US, although he was probably mixing up the country's name with its neighbour Greenland. Then, earlier this month, Trump's nominee for ambassador to Iceland, Billy Long, joked that the country would become the 52nd US state, and that he would be governor. Trump's interest in the area is especially concerning for Reykjavik, as it does not have an army and relies on its membership in NATO and a 1951 bilateral defence agreement with the US for its security. Facing up to the fact that the US is no longer a reliable partner for Iceland's security, to say the least, the incumbent government has reportedly pushed forward the referendum to restart EU talks. According to Politico, the Icelandic parliament is expected to announce the date for an EU referendum within the next few weeks, which could be as early as August. At the same time, the EU is starting to take its own security more seriously. Only a couple of weeks ago, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen pushed back against Mark Rutte's suggestion that Europe needs the US for its security, and suggested fortifying the EU's Article 42.7, which obliges member states to provide aid and assistance by all the means in their power if another is attacked, to become more like NATO's once ironclad Article 5. Meanwhile, there's been numerous signs of a strengthening in EU-Icelandic relations in recent months, including a flurry of diplomatic exchanges. Last month, the EU's Enlargement Commissioner Marta Koss met with Iceland's Foreign Minister, and von der Leyen met with Iceland's Prime Minister, with a visit to the Arctic region due again in March. Both sides emphasise that membership and partnership is increasingly becoming about security and stability in a turbulent geopolitical environment. So, how likely is it that Iceland could soon become an EU member state? Well, opinion polls from 2025 suggest a narrow majority in favour of EU membership, and if Icelanders vote yes, according to an EU official cited by Politico, Iceland could join the EU in just a year, before any other candidate country. This is mainly because Iceland has already adopted most EU laws, and is already a member of a number of EU treaties, such as Schengen and the EEA. Iceland is helped further by the fact that the UK, Iceland's main rival in the fishing industry, is no longer a member of the bloc. During 2009 to 2013, at the time of Iceland's negotiations, the two had a dispute dubbed the Mackerel War, which saw the EU threaten trade sanctions on Iceland. But with Britain now out of the EU, fishing rights could be less of a barrier. As we mentioned earlier, the latest edition of our magazine Too Long is out very soon. And if you subscribe using code SPRING26, then you'll get your first copy for as little as £4.99, as well as 20% off every future issue as long as you stay subscribed. The latest issue features our ranking of the world's 25 most influential people, using ratings from you, our audience, as well as from our journalists. Inside, we not only reveal the full ranking, but the stories of a number of people who made the list, from the return of Donald Trump and the calculated moves of Xi Jinping to the AI frontiers of Sam Altman. We look at the new entries, New York's first Muslim mayor Zohran Mamdani, the radical shift of Pope Leo XIV, and bastion of technocracy Mark Carney, as well as the shadows that still linger, like Jeffrey Epstein. Across 72 pages, this issue of Too Long features a whole lot more than just that. We also have a cover story on how the UK became more divided than ever, and how a broken country could rebuild, the fragmentation emerging within the EU, how religion is being hijacked by politicians, as well as much, much more. You can pre-order your copy at toolong.news, and remember to use code SPRING26 for the best ever price.